Marc Clair here for Bounding into Comics. And I just released a new article of my own that I want to tell you about. I did a review of the new Cobra Commander and Duke #1 issues from Skybound Entertainment by writer Joshua Williamson. And as you can tell from the headline, Joshua Williamson pens a G.I. Joe for the young fan in every Gen Xer's heart. I did, in fact, enjoy both of these titles quite a bit. Now, I already loved Daniel Warren Johnson's Transformers, what I've seen from that so far. My colleague Matt Battaglia has written about that extensively. You can find his articles on Battaglia's drawing board over at Bounding into Comics. Of course, you can also find the link to this particular article in the description for this video if you want to read along and check out what I wrote there about the series. But my main premise that I wanted to really relay here was a little bit more about my own history with G.I. Joe and the Transformers series. When I was growing up, I spent perhaps maybe an inordinate amount of time playing by myself. I was pretty much an only child. My sister moved out to college when I was only 5 years old. We had a pretty big age gap there. So I spent a lot of time playing with action figures, and I had all sorts of action figures. I had pro wrestlers. I had Thundercats. I had He-Man, and I had, of course, G.I. Joe and Transformers characters. And of course, since I had all these different toys, I would create these grandiose scenarios. Now, keep in mind, I'm 5 here, all right? Just relax. Don't judge me too harshly. But I would create these grandiose scenarios, and my different characters from different universes would cross over, and I would come up with all these different storylines in my mind. And to see that Skybound, and I know this is a cringe name for a lot of people, politically speaking, fair enough, Robert Kirkman actually was doing this with his label. And look, I don't like Robert Kirkman's politics probably any more than a lot of you do, but I'm not going to, look, if I had to cut everyone out of my life in every way that didn't agree with me politically, I wouldn't really talk. I would have a lot fewer people even in my circles. Let's just put it that way, especially after living in Los Angeles for 20 years. But I was open to this because, look, I loved Daniel Warren Johnson's Transformers, and I was definitely going to give Joshua Williamson a spin on what he did with G.I. Joe, especially knowing it was going to be connected to this larger universe. Now, I've read some of Joshua Williamson stuff at DC. Doesn't really stand out necessarily as incredible. However, considering we've seen a lot of absolute trash out of DC the last couple of years, I will say I was interested to at least see what he did outside the confines of DC, because some of his stuff at DC hasn't been all that bad on the sliding scale, let's just put it that way. But to dig into this article a bit, I do talk a bit about my own sort of, growing up with the G.I. Joe and Transformers cartoons. And for me, Matt Battaglia in his article talked about how the Transformers movie was sort of his holy grail. He would wear that thing out at the video store every single week. For me, it was G.I. Joe, the movie. All right, this movie, I probably watched this hundreds of times. And what I loved so much about G.I. Joe was the intricacy of the storylines, especially when it came to the villains, when it came to the breakdowns, and what I call here the almost Game of Thrones-esque political power struggle within the Cobra system, which was pretty high-level stuff for a show being watched by 5 to 8-year-olds, essentially. But there was a constant power struggle between Cobra Commander, Destro, Dr. Mindbender, eventually Serpentor, and then in the movie, when they brought in all of this backstory with Cobra Law, which hit or miss. Some people in the comments of this article said they didn't love the Cobra Law stuff when they were a kid. Look, when I was a kid, I loved it. I loved it a lot. And my favorite part of that movie was the storyline involving Cobra Commander, and how Cobra Commander actually kind of got turned on by his whole crew and was kind of left to the side, and he becomes somewhat of a sympathetic figure. So I always liked Cobra Commander because he was really conniving, but also was, he was always kind of being looked down upon and sort of seen as this sort of pathetic oaf in a way. So I always had a little bit of sympathy for Cobra Commander in an odd way. And I talk about that in this article, that this is really what I was going to be judging Joshua Williamson on. Duke, cool. Duke is like the A1 ace. He's great, and I did love the Duke book. I thought Duke was awesome, especially how they tie everything in to the Transformers series. That's what I talk about a lot here, and really Williamson's approach to these characters, especially when it came to Duke. A little shot of Cobra Commander there. Especially when it came to Duke. My favorite part of Duke, see Daniel Warren Johnson's Do a Powerbomb, my favorite series from last year, #1, not even a question. Duke is really, when we first meet him, he's traumatized by what many of you saw in Transformers #2, where he has basically just encountered, as you see here, a murderous transforming robot in the sky. And normally in a cartoon or series, an event like that'll happen and then, we'll just go to war. No, Duke is traumatized. He's traumatized because he saw one of his colleagues being killed by a killer robot, and he's being gaslit by his superiors telling him that's not what you really saw. And I really thought that the way that Joshua Williamson introduced this character tied it into the greater Transformers universe, but from the beginning introduced him as having to fight the system, not really necessarily battling for the system. I loved. So I loved Duke number 1, but then I was still kind of trepidatiously waiting. How was Joshua Williamson going to handle my beloved Cobra Commander? And I gotta say, I loved this book. I absolutely loved this book. And I wrote this article pretty much without spoilers, and I wanted to keep this all pretty spoiler-free. I try to keep my reviews at Bounding fairly spoiler-free because the point of my review for something, at least if it's something I enjoyed and I want you to read it, and if I want you to read it, then I don't want to spoil it, because a lot of the fun of this stuff is the surprises. Now, a lot of my point of this article here is that if you love this cartoon growing up, you love the G.I. Joe stuff, I think you're going to absolutely love what Joshua Williamson is doing with G.I. Joe and Cobra. If you didn't, which I didn't emphasize enough, if you're a younger fan, if you're not in your 40s like me and you didn't grow up with this stuff, I think this is such a cool series. And this version of Cobra Commander was so much... It's like they took what made Cobra Commander work and just cranked it up a notch, but really made him more of an alpha. This is not a pathetic, sympathetic character at all. This is a conniving, cunning character who clearly is operating behind the scenes on a higher level even than those who are his supposed superiors in Cobra Law. So that's about as much as I want to say about what actually happens in the plot besides some of these preview panels that have already been put out. I will say this. I have seen a few comments of people saying, well, this is coming from Robert Kirkman. It's all coming underneath him. Eventually, they're just going to give you something good for nostalgia and then bring in the woke messaging. Look, it's possible, right? But when I came on board with Bounding into Comics, one thing I really wanted to do was highlight comics and books that I have enjoyed. And what a freaking cool panel this is. I wanted to highlight comics, issues, series, creators, artists that I'm enjoying out there that are something different. That's why I talked a lot about the Rippaverse and what they're doing with that, because I've enjoyed it, and it's something different, and I want you to check it out. Doesn't mean you have to love it. But same thing with this stuff, too. I grew up with these toys, and seeing them in a shared universe like this, and seeing it done very effectively, to me, I'm not going to tell anybody, don't enjoy this because there might be woke messaging down the road. I don't know if there will be or there won't be. There certainly wasn't any in these issues. I will say that. Nothing I could really discern in that way. So if the woke messaging is coming, I will promise you right now, if I see it, I will call it out, and I will lead the charge in decrying it. But as long as we're getting good stories, which I really do believe we have so far from both Transformers, Void Rivals, hit or miss. I kind of enjoyed it, but it didn't blow me away. If that was a standalone, contribution to this universe, I don't know how I'd feel about it. But the Transformers and Daniel Warren Johnson, as well as Joshua Williamson's writing on both of these books, frankly, absolutely stellar. So I highly do recommend checking out the Skybound universe here, the Energon universe within Skybound, especially if you grew up with these books and with these characters and these cartoons. But if you didn't, I really think there's some solid stuff here for you too. But I'm just going to end this for all the people making comments that, look, don't get excited. The woke messaging is on the way. I don't know if it is. I don't know if it isn't. I promise you right now, if I see it, I'll call it out, and I'll be just as annoyed as you are. But until then, I'm not going to get upset ahead of time. I'm going to enjoy the ride. And right now, frankly, the ride's been awesome. So do check out the full article at boundingintocomics.com. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of the great content from the team here at Bounding into Comics.